here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of the author and writer Peter Guralnick, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love, poetry and all that other groovy stuff. Has just written a new book that's come out on White Rabbit Publishing, The Colonel and the King. This is the story of Tom Parker, the Elvis Presley manager who formed the partnership that rocked the world. Peter's done several books on Elvis before, as well as Sam Phillips and various other people. But this is the interview, so after several minutes of interest but casual chat, we get down to the exciting subject of the early formative years. Peter, it's over to you.
The thing that just woke me up was my first exposure to the blues when I was around 16 or so, 15, 16. And that just was really a baptism by fire. I mean, I felt like I was lost in it from the moment I first heard it. And I can't really explain that. But before that, I'd heard a whole range of music. I'd certainly been exposed to things, like Elvis and Little Richard in particular. Little Richard just knocked me out when I first heard him because it was so entirely different.
Yes.
But what I responded to, which is sort of interesting, and I don't think you want the whole backstory, but what I responded to is something that I didn't know and didn't recognize, which was really the blues component in both Elvis's music and in Little Richard's. But I couldn't have named it or told you what it was at the time.
Right. Yes, well, absolutely. It's interesting you mentioned those two because obviously I'd sort of said that David Bowie was this kind of great influence on my life, and he was born I think 1947, which actually I think it was on the birthday of Elvis Presley, wasn't he? He had this big connection with Elvis, David.
January 8th?
Yes, I think that was his birthday, yes.
I didn't know that, yeah.
So him and also a person called Lemmy, who was in Motorhead, who was the same year, both would say, when people asked them what their influence, it was always Little Richard followed by Elvis as the two people that were there, which, you can only be that age obviously once, kind of 15, 16, but that music is what stays with you for the rest of your life. And so
well, it's the reason, in a sense, why generational discriminations are just silly. We're all born into a generation from which we can't fully escape. But to say, it was so much better in those days, whatever it is, it's always going to be the same. Although I've got to say that growing up in today's age, I think, is more challenging, more difficult than anything I could ever have imagined in terms of the political landscape, in terms of just the threat to annihilation, really, in every way. I mean, I grew up like so many people. I mean, talking about and terrified of the bomb and, sheltering under desks, and the Holocaust was a big thing, but there are Holocausts going on everywhere now.
Yes.
And so I just can't say it's like Woody Allen's Portrait of Paris in the 1890s, and everybody in the 20s is saying, if I could only have lived then. But that's what every generation says.
Yes, well, this is very true. I guess you would have grown up with Duck and Cover, wouldn't you, at that point, which was quite scary.
To a degree, and like in phys ed and gym class, you would do these military drills, and I've got to say that this was, and all of this was a nightmare for me, but it's nothing like the nightmare that kids have to face today.
Yes, we've also got climate change, which is
you get everything. You get the whole range.
Yes, and trillionaires who are quite happy to be trillionaires. I know it's very scary. But did you? I mean, I didn't mean to talk about this, but David Bowie, when he did his album, his last one, Black Star, people often think it was a reference to his love of David Bowie, in reference to the Elvis Presley, when you see your Black Star come in, it's something, I'm paraphrasing this line, aren't I? Did you sort of, you would have probably heard that connection that people have read into the album title of Bowie's last release?
Well, to a degree. I mean, I was aware of David Bowie. I felt like he was a widely read person, as well as the wide range of his musical influences. So he was somebody that I could admire, but it my engagement was so deeply, so almost exclusively with black music, with the blues, with rhythm and blues, with soul music, with gospel music, and then later with country too, but really almost as it related to soulfulness, the kind of soulfulness that I had gotten from black music as well, that you get in with Merle Haggard or Waylon Jennings or variety, Billy Joe Shaver. So
Yes.
I was never close to the center or the mainstream of pop. It just wasn't something that I engaged with. It wasn't that I judged it, but it was not. I mean, the Beatles, for example, were not of any great moment to me, which is not a put down. And I've got to say, after seeing Get Back, I'm a Beatles fan. But that was a long time. It took a long time to get there.
Well,
But honestly, so I mean, whether it's James Brown or Solomon Burke or Muddy Waters or Robert Pete Williams or Johnny Shines, these were my heroes from the time I was a kid. And this was Howlin' Wolf. This was the music with which I totally engaged. And I don't mean to be stuck in the past. I mean, I feel like, there are there are all kinds of things which I admire, which I'm drawn to. Nick Lowe is somebody whom I've, very much admired over the years. And Elvis Costello, I mean, King of
oh, yes.
America, or his collaboration with Alan Toussaint was one of the chapters in my Looking to Get Lost, and that was just both moving and fascinating to me. So I don't. I don't mean to get stuck in one place or in one bag, but that is to a large extent what the the tentacles, the outreach of black music of all kinds, of I guess you'd call it, of the music that came alive in my generation over the years. So
Yes, well, absolutely. I'm glad you like King of America by Elvis Costello. That was one of those albums I remember consuming quite a lot when it came out in the mid 80s, and being very sort of mesmerized by both side one and two, because we got it on vinyl.
it's such a brilliant album.
It is just genius. And yes, there was a real sort of moment with Elvis. Yeah, he knew who to collaborate to, which was very good. And obviously Nick Lowe, he covered What's So Funny About Peace, Love and Understand, which I did an interview with Steve Naive, the keyboard player, and he finishes every concert with that song, which obviously probably means more now than he did back in the 70s when it was written originally. So yes, do we need that now? So yes, which leads lovely to the book, which, so you done, just to sort of recap for the listeners, you did Sweet Soul Music, which was one of those books that gets held as a essential classic. And then you did one, Searching for Robert Johnson, but then it was the Last Train to Memphis, Careless Love with Elvis. So when did you start your fascination with Elvis? When did this... Well, you said earlier, didn't you? But
I'm telling you, what drew me to Elvis, oddly enough, was the discovery of his Sun's Sides, which I didn't get to until he was in the Army, and RCA put out A Date with Elvis and For LP Fans Only. I forget in which order, which had many of the Sun's Sides, like That's All Right or Mystery Train or Good Rockin' Tonight, which I had never heard before. And that, I'm just confessing my ignorance. And at that point, I was so deep into the blues, so it wasn't as if I heard Elvis and I said, aha, this is the man, this is the guy. But what it was I knew the Arthur Crudup, I knew the Little Junior Parker, I knew the originals, and I just thought, man, this guy is a great blues singer. Not someone to replace everybody else, just someone to take his place along with everybody else. And that's what really drew me into everything. And as far as writing about Elvis went, I really hadn't, well, the first pieces I wrote for Boston After Dark, Boston Phoenix, which was the underground weekly in Boston, like the Village Voice, and started in 67. And I think the first three pieces I wrote were on Muddy Waters, Solomon Burke, and Elvis Presley, or Jerry Lee Lewis. I mean, to me at that point, I saw it all as a continuum. I just saw it as everything was outgrowth of everything else. And both the black and white traditions were mixed. And, you saw somebody like Solomon Burke, for example, who had his first hit just out of reach as a country singer and who had perfect enunciation. And one of the things that I always envisioned, I mean, I met Solomon in 1980. I was friendly with him until his death. I mean, he was just an extraordinary, exuberant personality. But a friend of mine, Steve Bing, became friendly with, I introduced him to Solomon, and he was very close to Jerry Lewis, brought the two of them together. They sang this great duet on a Merle Haggard song. But we were talking about doing an album with Solomon where he would explore his roots.
Right.
And one of the roots would be Gene Autry, and that this was one of his favorite singers. And another would be Brother Joe May, the Thunderbolt of the Midwest. And I just thought, how cool would that be? It never happened, but it would be one of the many projects which I, yearn to accomplish. I could name 100 others if you'd like.
Just floated around, yes. But then what the sort of after Sweet Soul Music, which does feature in, I think, David Bowie's list of 100 essential books or something.
That's why I say he's a very well-read person.
Oh, good. I'm so glad someone told you. What drew you to sort of writing about Elvis? Because this was in the mid-90s, wasn't it?
It was in the late 80s.
Late 80s. I'm glad I got my dates right, actually.
And in fact, I had already begun the Elvis when Searching for Robert Johnson came out. But what led me to the Elvis was I wrote. I mean, I wrote in '67, I think, about 3 singles that Elvis had just put out. This is for the Boston Phoenix, and it was sort of pretentiously framed. Elvis is going back to his roots because this was things like U.S. Mail and Guitar Man and Big Boss Man, You Don't Know Me. And they were wonderful singles. And I'm saying, something's coming. And, I'm an idiot. So, I mean, what do I know about something's coming? But then something did come, which was the '68 special. And so I reviewed that, which to me was just made an extraordinary impact, just a tremendous impact. And then the next thing was From Elvis in Memphis in '69. And I reviewed that for Rolling Stone. I think the first thing I did for Rolling Stone, I may have the order mixed up, was a full page on Solomon Burke, and the next thing was From Elvis in Memphis, or the other way around. So you can see.
Right.
And then I wrote the chapter for the Rolling Stone Illustrated History of Rock and Roll, which came out in '77, the year of Elvis, right around the time of Elvis's death. And I thought that was it. I mean, I thought, okay, I've written about Elvis theoretically, just like my writing about the singles and saying, it's coming. I was just saying, what did I know? What does anyone know about, you read the tea leaves, but, you don't know what the context is. So, and then, so I wrote this long chapter in the Rolling Stone Illustrated History about Elvis, and I figured that's it. And then I started working on this documentary, which I dropped out of 2/3 of the way through, and it's sort of irrelevant, but in which for the first time, this was in '87, I think, I was exposed, because this is before the internet.
Well, yes.
Everything was before the internet.
Yes, and, not even dial-up.
So I was exposed for the first time to the interviews he had done in '55, '56, '50, some of which are just brilliant. And I thought, I suddenly had this revelation, Elvis can speak for himself. And because that's what I was using to frame the narration for this documentary. And right after that, I was driving down the street that Stax is on. Oh, man. I can think of something Avenue. Anyway, this is terrible, but anyway, so I'm driving down with a friend of mine, Rose Clayton, who had grown up in South Memphis. That's where Stax was, and we're going by the Assembly of God Church to where Elvis had gone. But we go by this boarded-up drugstore, and Rose says, Elvis used to sit in there waiting for his cousin Jean to get off work, and he would sit there and he just couldn't stop moving. He was so jittery and everything. And then she just said, "Poor baby." And that was it. I just had this flash of inspiration that he could be portrayed as a real person. This was in combination with reading the interviews. And so anyway, that was what it's kind of a foolish or a flash of blinding flash of illumination, but
Well,
that
yes.
was what that was really what led me. And not long after that, I wrote a proposal. I didn't think anyone would accept it because, you see, Elvis was not taken seriously, and the whole premise of my book was that he was a conscious creative artist, that he hadn't just, lightning hadn't just struck. He didn't simply possess natural talent, which was discovered. Nobody had made him. He had made himself. And I thought, nobody's going to go for this because this simply doesn't fit into the narratives that most people have embraced.
Well, yes, absolutely.
But anyway, to my surprise and ultimately to my great satisfaction, or just
Relief.
It was my proposal was accepted. A number of people were interested in it, and that was the origin of the book.
Yes. And what was your relationship like with Elvis during that sort of 67 to 77, those 10 years when he was still active and doing concerts and doing sort of albums and going through a rather difficult period towards the end? And you were there, obviously you were, sort of on the case. Were you?
No, I wasn't on the case at all. I was.
No, but you were conscious of him if you were back, reading about him in the late 60s.
Right, but
he still had
really
10 more years, didn't he, before he passed away?
Yeah, but that really wasn't my focus. I mean, I was writing about, like I say, Otis Redding. I was doing sweet soul music. I was writing about Waylon Jennings. I was writing about, I was writing about Charlie Rich, who was a great passion.
Yes.
And in a sense, might represent one of the paths that Elvis might have taken. So, no, maybe it's disingenuous of me to say, but that was not of any consequence to me. It wasn't.
No.
It wasn't like Elvis wasn't my guy. I wasn't his fanboy. I wasn't looking to to follow his career in that way. And I wasn't. I wasn't drawn to the pageantry. I wasn't. I mean, I saw him once at the Boston Garden in 1971, and it was thrilling in the sense of community that you got from the audience. But basically, it was a tableau. It was a tableau. What do you call it? A tableau vivant or something.
Right.
And he struck a lot of poses, and I didn't have any criticism, but it wasn't something that drew me to him, and it wasn't something that, from my perspective, expanded or extended his music. So you say I was on the scene. I was on my scene. That didn't happen to be.
That was a different scene. Yes.
Yeah.
Can you remember
it's not a put down. I'm just saying that's the reality.
The truth. But can you remember where you were when you heard Elvis had passed away? Can you remember that moment, or was that not on your radar?
Well, I can, because I ran a boys' camp for my grandfather had started it. He got sick in 70, and I ran it from then until 1992 when I closed it. And I was very close to him. He had asked me to help him before he got sick, and so I ended up doing it, and it was very rewarding in its own way. But I was going down the steps from the porch that I lived on down to the Rock Amphitheater where we held the evening assembly, and a counselor named Donald Unger. And if you ever run into him, be sure to mention that I mentioned his name. He always wants to be sure that his name gets me. He came up to me and he told me. So that's when I heard.
Right.
And then I went and ran the assembly.
Yes, and then just went in. Yes, it was just one of those moments, I think. But again, yes, Elvis by then had, just become a different. I suppose during that period and then the 80s, it almost seemed a bit irrelevant, didn't he? And I guess you mentioned almost or implied that by the 90s, you wondered if anybody would be remotely interested in Elvis Presley, I guess. And Yes, if
No,
anyone.
it wasn't so much what they'd be interested in Elvis, and this was, and not to, this is of no great consequence. I don't mean to go all pedantic on you, but
No, do.
I began the book in the beginning of '98. I mean '88, sorry, beginning of '88, and wrote the proposal in '87. So, but no, it wasn't so much that I didn't think. I was aware that Elvis enjoyed a certain celebrity, but that's different from being taken seriously as a creative artist, and that was the part that I didn't think. I didn't think that people were prepared, or particularly people in publishing, were prepared to embrace a book the book is not written as an argument. The book is written as a story and as a
Yes.
character study, but at its core, it both suggests and explores the sources of his creativity and his creative inspiration. And that was what I wanted to write about, just as I did with Sam Cooke. I mean, to me, the biography of Sam Cooke, Dream Boogie, is something which it attempts to explore as a world, the world that Sam Cooke grew up in and the world that he helped shape. And in many ways, Last Train to Memphis, the first volume of the Elvis biography, is in some ways as much about Memphis as it is about Elvis. And it begins with a scene in which Sam Phillips, the owner of Sun Records, and Dewey Phillips, the WHBQ disc jockey, meet in 1950, long when Elvis is still in high school, and he's not in the picture at all. And the idea is that it doesn't foreshadow Elvis, but it describes the world and the creative world in which Elvis grew up, without alluding
Yes.
to Elvis.
Yeah. That's so then
And just to go back for a second,
yes.
you asked me about how I saw Elvis in later years. Well, I mean, Careless Love is called The Unmaking of Elvis Presley, and it's intended to be a compassionate. I mean, it was difficult to write. I'm sure it's more difficult, a lot more difficult to read than Last Train to Memphis, because it is, in many respects, a tragedy. But I began that book with Elvis, not with Elvis being in the Army, where he was utterly miserable, not because he was not patriotic or thought he was above anybody else, but because he felt his opportunity, his luck was gone. And but it begins not with that, which is chronologically the beginning of the book. It begins with him returning to Memphis and kissing the ground, just with this agenda, this creative agenda. Just there's so much he wants to accomplish, and the conceit of the book, or the thread of it, is to see him accomplish it. I mean, what he did. I mean, I've got to disagree with John Lennon here, and what he did upon his return from the Army, with that first album, This Is Elvis, with the gospel recordings, his Hand in Mine, with his ballad singing in 60, 61, 62. It's superlative. It's just really, in some ways, it's the pinnacle of his art. Not his popularity, but his art. And so that's what I tried to get across. And all the way through the book, I tried to return to those creative moments, those moments in which you see a kind of redemption, in the hopes that both I and the reader would forget what the end was going to be.
Yes. God. Yeah. Well, absolutely. I mean, I guess at that point you thought, right, that's Elvis done. So then the Colonel. I mean, obviously. I mean, when you mentioned those interviews, I mean, there's the film that you're going to say, oh no, he's going to mention the film, but Baz Luhrmann's film that came out with all this kind of the interviews that he had of Elvis that he thought he'd seen in the salt mines of Warner Music or somewhere. Were you aware of them? Had you also heard those recordings? And
well, they were all in Careless Love.
Right.
They weren't in the salt mines. They were all available.
I thought they were
I mean, I'm not claiming credit for it. It's no credit to me, but there's nothing new in there.
Right.
And that doesn't denigrate it.
No, not at all. It's just, yes, I just got that impression that Baz had sort of realised that there was these recordings that hadn't been
for
heard.
example, the interview he did in '72 for the Elvis on Tour, that's a thread all the way through Careless Love.
Right. There you
So,
go.
and honestly, to say that, it sounds like, oh, I'm so great. I find nobody found it. He did it. And Jerry Schilling set it up. And Jerry Schilling persuaded him to do it. And Jerry Schilling was at his side when it was being done. And it is very similar, maybe even surpasses the interviews he did early in his career in 55, 56, which are extraordinarily open and eloquent. And here, as he's in the 72 interview where he's talking about going to Overton Park to hear the Memphis Symphony play and watching the conductor, just have control over this magnificent orchestra with just using a baton. And in some ways, I can't remember if in that interview he does, or in another, he relates that to the kind of thing he wanted to do in Las Vegas. He wanted to bring all these different, in his Las Vegas act,
Yeah.
and he wanted to bring all these different strands of American music, and not just American, but mostly American, together. And he wanted an orchestra, and he wanted, and so it's a great interview. I mean, it's
Yes.
just, but it's not new.
It's not new. Okay, so it's good to clear these things up. I mean, yes,
I don't think it matters. I don't think it matters.
It doesn't matter either, but it's still so. Yes, so then you did the two Elvis book, or three, and then
The two, yeah.
two, and then obviously the Colonel. We all had a very, we all couldn't vote on what we thought of the Colonel. Then sort of you decide to write a book on the Colonel. How did this all sort of come about? Did you suddenly wake up in the night and think, the Colonel, there must be more to him than that? What was the reason?
No. It was a pretty simple process. I was Last Train to Memphis had come out, and Jack Soden, who was the head of Graceland and the head of EPE, Elvis Presley Enterprises, and remains the head of Graceland, a wonderful guy. And he called me up, and he said, I was going to write you a letter. I said, oh, you should. And he said, that, and he did. But he said, and then he lavished great praise. I mean, he was very, very sweet about Last Train to Memphis. And he said, I think if you were to ask me the question now that you've asked me over and over again, which was whether I could gain access to the archives at Graceland, which were largely, they could be called the Colonel archives because he kept everything and he had a record of everything. But I didn't know that then. I didn't know what it was. And he says, but Jack says, if you were to ask me that question, I think you'd get a different answer. So not being entirely stupid, I asked him the question and he said yes. And so my wife Alexandra and I went down there, and the Colonel's archives, which were, like I say, that was really the paper archives, were housed in this warehouse near Graceland, just in this kind of dreary, cavernous building. And we started off, and it was just like being let loose in is it Ali Baba's cave or Aladdin's cave? I can't remember.
It would be full of exciting things.
Well, it was just unimaginable things, because everything was documented. But among other things that I discovered in the course of doing that, was the Colonel's correspondence. And again, it gave, it opened up a side of Colonel, something I had never previously imagined. First of all, his brilliance. Second of all, his humor. Maybe the other way around. First of all, his humor, then his brilliance, his attention to business, and just what an extraordinary role, in a positive sense, he had played in Elvis Presley's career. So after a year or two of this, going back and forth, and Alexandra and I, going through these things and speaking, because there was a rash of burglaries at that time into Elvis's papers or artifacts or something. And I told Jack, I said, look, I don't want you to worry about any of this. I'm not going to copy anything. We're just going to talk all the documents into tape recorders. So we have, God knows how many tapes of all these documents and records and letters. And after a couple of years, I said to Jack, we should do a book of Colonel's letters, because it would have to be in conjunction with the estate, because they owned all the letters. And he said, yeah, we should. And we were on the verge of doing it when Lisa, and in the meantime, I had done this book, Elvis Day by Day, which was an attempt to offer to the world. You okay there?
Yes. I was just
Okay.
kind of but yes, I was just looking at that. That came
Okay.
out. That
But
was
anyway, but
about.
it was the point was I had acquired all this knowledge, all this dating, things that had never been able to be documented before, and I wasn't going to put this in a book. The book wasn't intended to be encyclopedia, not the biography, but I felt like the world should have it. People should be able to check these things out for themselves. I mean, whether it's Elvis's tryout for Arthur Godfrey, which had, I knew it had happened, but I never knew when exactly. And so that was the impetus for the genesis of for Elvis Day by Day, and Jack was very enthusiastic about it, and we did it. I mean, we did it together in the sense that they owned all of the material, and so Colonel's letters, which isn't what this book is, were going to be next. And then Lisa Marie sold the estate, and that sort of changed everything. And it took about 20 years for me to get back there and to be back in touch with the new owners of the estate, ABG. And eventually we worked out an understanding, which was about the same as what Jack and I had agreed on to begin with. And I began the book. But in the meantime, see, this is for all listeners out there.
Yes.
Don't be afraid of waiting 20 or 30 years to realize an ambition. On the other hand, don't ever expect it's necessarily going to happen. But in the meantime, shortly after I had started work on the, I'm going to sound like Trump, on the concept of a book about the Colonel with his letters, Colonel's widow, Loanne, whom I had met at his 80th birthday party in '89 and knew somewhat over the years. I was talking to her, because I always called her on Colonel's birthday, and I was talking to her, and she was very enthusiastic about the idea that the world might finally learn what Colonel actually did, good and bad. It didn't matter, but I mean, the point was the truth of, rather than these kind of the caricature that had been created by people who never knew him, never worked with him, and didn't really know what the story was. So she says, is there any way I can help? And I said, yeah, definitely. So we started talking, and she started, we talked quite a bit. She sent me letters, and that filled in an enormous amount of Colonel's early years, which again, given the absence of Colonel, there was no other source for. I mean, there just was no, and so I realized the book could no longer just be his letters. It should incorporate this material, which again was intended to set the record straight and show and tell something of his extraordinary story as close as possible to the actual facts and what had actually happened. And so that's how the book evolved. And so the front of the book is maybe a 200-page biography, which by my standards, that's a short biography.
Yes.
And it's not a full-scale biography. And then the second part of the book are the letters, and they're intended to amplify and complement each other.
Yes, because had you had you gone along with the general idea of who, what the Colonel was, and the sort of general easy, well, this is, he controlled Elvis. He didn't let him go abroad. He was a dodgy guy from sort of.
Well, let me just back up for 1 second. He controlled Elvis. This again would suppose, and I know that people who say this don't mean it. It would suppose that Elvis was some kind of a slow-witted fellow. And nobody controlled Elvis other than Elvis. And maybe if he'd controlled himself better, he would have been better off. But that's a whole other argument. I mean, I'm not a moralist.
No.
And but the point is, Sam Phillips didn't control Elvis. Sam Phillips, it was an amazing thing that Elvis should have walked into a studio where so much great music had been recorded, and which was guided by someone who was so visionary. I mean, whether it came to Howlin' Wolf, Little Junior Parker, Ike Turner, B.B. King, or Elvis Presley. But Sam Phillips, as he would have been the first to tell you, he didn't create Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley did. And the same way, Colonel didn't louse up Elvis's life. If it was loused up, I mean, Elvis was an adult, and the life he led was the life he wanted to lead. But anyway, to go back to your question, which I completely loused up there, I know.
That's fine. Yes, yes. It's given us a different idea of who the Colonel was about and given him more depth. Did you suddenly feel that that was your, not duty, but did you feel like actually you need to put this across so that
Well,
suddenly...
yes. I mean, I saw it. It was my duty not to Colonel, but to history and to a restitution of a true history. And if you look, and I'm not suggesting anybody do this, but if you look at Careless Love, the the character who animates the book, I mean, when Elvis is really lost in a number of different worlds, including his spiritual studies with Larry Geller, but in which there isn't a lot of action. The person who is moving the story along is Colonel, this is in Careless Love, who plays a kind of Falstaffian role, and who is, as I saw it, like Falstaff offers lots of great rollicking fun, which Colonel did, and that's his primary role. In a sense, it's almost like he's a character. I'm not disowning Careless Love, and I think it is more than that in this. When I wrote Looking to Get Lost, the portrait, which is as close to an autobiography as I'll ever come, but it's a series of portraits. But the portrait of Colonel, again, portrays somebody who is a lovable rogue, maybe. I mean, I'm doing it as a service to my own work, so I apologize to myself. But but he's somebody who, for example, if he loses $1 million, at the gambling table, he can just laugh it off. It doesn't mean a thing to him because he doesn't care about money, which is true. He didn't care about money any more than Elvis did. The two of them made the most extraordinary amounts of money. Neither one of them cared the least bit, and each of them had full confidence that they could make more money. Elvis by his talent, Colonel by his management. But that isn't what the portrait in The Colonel and the King, the book about the Colonel. There, I confronted something which I had never fully imagined. I mean, in the end, the book is a tragedy. It's a linked tragedy between Elvis and Colonel. But the portrait of Colonel shows. I mean, Loanne. Nobody could have loved a spouse more than Loanne admired Colonel. And yet the portrait she pictures is of someone so addicted to gambling that he could spend 18, 24 hours straight in the casino in Las Vegas, either before a tour started, where again, he was sang-froid to the sang-froid. I mean, Colonel never showed this to the world, and yet here he was. I mean, anything less than full control. But in fact, he was beset by worry, by concern for Elvis, by concern for himself, and he was addicted to gambling. And Loanne threatened at one point. And I can only imagine how much this cost her, because she wanted a positive picture of Colonel to be presented.
Right.
And she believed, as I believe, that he was truly a genius who achieved something that nobody else could have achieved. And yet she she said to him, "You care more about this gambling than you do about me. I think we should resume a strictly professional relationship," which she didn't. And at the very end, Colonel says to her, "If I'm forced to leave this country," I don't know if he specified, "and go back to Holland, which is where he was from, would you go with me?" And to me, that was just heartbreaking. I mean, this is an old man, perhaps beset by certain failures of, I mean, his intellect was sharp, but maybe he had emotional dementia or something.
Yes.
But
Well,
still, it
quite.
was just. And again, to go back, this is terrible to keep backtracking. But the one thing that bore out my overall impression of Colonel is that not a single person who worked with him, not a single person who actually knew him. I mean, for instance, the guys around Elvis, whom I knew quite a bit, and I've been very friendly with Jerry Schilling. They were all different. Each of them had his own predilections, his own gifts. Red West was a very gifted songwriter, actor. They had no idea what was going on between Elvis and Colonel. The only person who knew was Vernon, and the only three people in the room were Elvis, Vernon, and Colonel. And there's good reason why the guys around Elvis should have resented him, because both he and Vernon, whom they also resented, and not universally, not in very different ways, but each of them saw the guys around Elvis as being superfluous, as being guys who were just riding on his fame and just getting a free ride. So, but none of them had. But the people who worked with Colonel, and I've met many of them, agents, managers, people who worked for him, people he worked with, universally saw him as a man of honor, as a person who was always true to his word. All you needed was a handshake. And even Sam Phillips, who never really knew him, and only came to know him from the time of that 80th birthday party in '89. From that point on, almost totally revised his opinion of Colonel, because he recognized his brilliance in what he did, which was something altogether different from what Sam did. My presence, I mean, I couldn't believe that the Colonel invited me. I didn't know him at all at that point. He invited me to the birthday, and at the end, when I went up to thank him, and I, mumbled, my name and said, "Oh, thanks so much," and this and that. Well, I'll back up to that in a second. But when I came up to him, he was sitting under a sculpture, an ice sculpture of an elephant. He loved elephants. And he and Sam Phillips, Colonel and Sam Phillips, at this 80th birthday party in Las Vegas, were going at it, hammer and tongs, intellectual hammer and tongs, about the exact sequence of the exact events that took place in November of 1955, when Sam sold Elvis's contract to RCA through Colonel's intercession. Each of them had every detail at his fingertips.
Right.
Each of them could talk not just about the day, and not just about the month, not the week, not the day, not the hour, but the minute that this was done. And each of them totally disagreed. But I mean, from that point on, Sam Phillips had an entirely different relationship and respect for the Colonel. I mean, they weren't best friends, but for me, I'm going up there, this little guy, and to thank the Colonel for inviting me. And Colonel just looks at me and says, "I put you on the list." And I'm saying, yeah. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I know. And I said, "No, look, thanks so much." He says, "I put you on the list." And the third time he said, "I put you on the list," I realized that he had put me on the list. And in fact, that's the way it turned out. He had, by giving me his blessing, his imprimatur, he had made it possible for me to follow up on that. I didn't talk to anybody at the party about what I was doing, but he gave me the opportunity to follow up on that with people who would never otherwise have talked to me. And I could write them letters and say, "I met you and that was all, again, thanks to the Colonel." So, but in his own subtle way.
Yes, very subtle. But did you, I mean, at that stage and meeting Tom Parker, the Colonel, did you, I mean, I think you say in the book, was there a possibility of doing an interview with him at this stage and sort of getting almost a biography written with his consent? Was that ever? Did you ever feel like this could be something which would just?
When you say, "Do I ever feel?" I mean, that's like asking me, "Do you ever fantasize at night?" It's like, no. But I'll tell you, the closest I could come to that was that afterwards, 10 years. Well, he died in '95, I think. So, 5-6 years after his death, Luann said to me, and I can't hold this out as verification, because, people say things to you and they want to make you feel good. And I don't know. I mean, but she was a very nice person, but also a very honest person. She says, there were so many times when Colonel was on the verge of talking to you, when he, and she said, I said to him, "Why don't you just talk to him? Why don't you, because he was aware of the Elvis biography."
Yes.
He called me up as soon as he had either read or gotten Last Train to Memphis. He asked me how much had it cost me to get that advertisement, that all that space in the Los Angeles Times. What he was referring to was the review of the book in the Los Angeles Times, but treated it as an entrepreneur always might, as it was an advertisement of the book. It wasn't a very good review, actually,
Right.
but it didn't matter. It was all that space. So he asked me, but so she said that, but no, I never really. I would have. There's so many questions that I'd still like to ask Colonel.
Well, yes, and I just wondered if that was one of those things you thought, right? I've been to his 80th birthday. I must be able to sort of.
No, I never thought that. But my correspondence with him, which began which began as soon as I met him, I wrote to him. I met him at the Elvis birthday celebration, and it probably wasn't January 8th, but it was right around that time in 88.
Right.
And I wrote to him right away. I got his address and I wrote to him, and I heard back immediately. And we embarked upon this epistolary friendship or relationship, which it became a kind of friendship in which he would upbraid me from time to time. I would apologize. He says, no, don't worry, friend Peter. And the letters would open, friend Peter, and they would close, your friend, then written, sometimes typed in upper and lower case, but maybe written Colonel, and underneath typed the Colonel.
That's such a nice touch. Now, going back to this archive, because we love archiving, I just went to the V&A archive to see David Bowie's, was part of his collection and selection.
Where was that?
That was in London at the V&A. They've now got, Bowie had so much stuff. I think his estate probably thought, actually, we can't hold this stuff. Let's give it to someone else to look after. And
that's great. How great!
And so you could sort of get his lyric sheets. You could get his, look at his clothing. You can not order, but you can ask to see it, and they'll give you 5 items to touch with your white gloves. With the
white gloves are very important.
With the white, yes, I know, and
yes.
It made it a very special occasion, as you can imagine. That, my God, this is the jacket that David wore then, and this is these pair of trousers that he wore at this occasion. So, being a fan, one's obsessed and keen, and feels a bit sort of like, you feel a bit emotional with it. What was it like with seeing the sort of archive here at in sort of Gracelands? Was that also quite a spiritual experience for you?
No, I'm not big into spirituality. I'm not, but it was thrilling. It was absolutely thrilling. I'll go that. And the thing was that in the warehouse, that was one thing. But then at the end of the day, we might be in the warehouse from, let's say, 9 to 5, which is a long day in a warehouse.
Yeah.
Then we would drive up through the gates of Graceland, to Vernon's office, where nothing, nowhere near as much, but a great deal of stuff was kept. And at some point, not from Vernon's office, but from up in the attic, we got these postcards that Vernon had written to Gladys from prison, from Parchment Farm. And that was amazing, and up until then, I never was clear, because I wasn't clear what the level of Vernon's education was, and I didn't know if he could write letters or not, but they were very nice postcards. And then later I recognized how hard he had worked trying to protect his son. And with this office was not a ceremonial office. The letters that he wrote, the stands that he took were impressive. But the most, if you want spiritual, and I don't know what to call this, we were in the room. The file cabinets hadn't been opened since Vernon's death, which was probably in 80, I think, or maybe right around that time. So they had to bring in somebody who, broke the chains that had locked up the file cabinets. Right. But it was not a working. It was on the tour, which is why we couldn't go up there until 5:30, so these were late night dinners. I mean, boy, by the time we finished, we were both tired and hungry. Both.
Yes, well, quite.
But so one night we're sitting there. And somebody had made a point to say, well, the phone that's sitting there, was disconnected 20 years ago. So we're going through the papers, one of which was a letter I had written to Elvis requesting an interview, saying, I just want to talk about music. And there it was in Vernon's, Alexandra found it. She said, you got to see this, you got to see this. And so I discovered myself with my white gloves on.
Yes.
So one night we're in there, and it maybe it was 9 o'clock or something, and the phone rings, and we just look at each other, what should we do? Should we answer it? And it keeps ringing and ringing, and and then we never answered. So who knows? Who knows who it was? Was it Colonel
Wow.
saying, "Stop looking"? Was it Elvis? From the great
Well, this
beyond?
is what we're all thinking, aren't we? Ah, that's amazing. Yes, that must have been good. So then you have the idea of publishing the letters, and then you think, no, let's kind of add more to it at the beginning. So with writing the first half of the book, did you
Mhm.
find did having done the research, did that sort of completely reshape what your sort of idea of the Colonel was? Did you have to go and do lots more research on his early years in Holland and
Well, there,
Netherlands?
there wasn't a lot more to do. I mean, there wasn't that much available. Alana Nash did a good job, but so did on those early years. But so did Dutch writer. Oh, I can't believe I'm forgetting his name. He was a reporter on the Breda newspaper, and his book is really terrific and is the basis for all the research because he talked to all the family and all the people who were still alive at that time. This is right after Elvis's death. I can almost picture. I'd feel terrible towards his memory, not remembering his
Yes.
name. So I spoke at considerable length with the Colonel's nephew, his brother's son, who had written the letter preparing the way for his father, At, A.D. I guess the D is pronounced as a T. I'm not Dutch, but that's what I'm told. And At Jr. had written the letter when he was 18 or 19 years old for his father to the Colonel, which led to his father visiting in 61, which represented a considerable change in Colonel's outlook, I think, because he had, up till that time, I think he felt he had outrun his past. And here his past came up to meet him. And although he didn't have any further contact with the family, I think that up until then, he had spoken and written quite seriously about a world tour for Elvis up until 1960 with Abe Lastfogel, who was the head of William Morris, and prior to that, with an Australian promoter named Lee Gordon, who was actually from Detroit originally, who had brought rock and roll to Australia. And all of that seemed quite feasible. Once he saw his brother, and there's a lot in the book, as there's a lot in life that I can't fully explain, but it would appear that once his brother had come and once everybody in Holland at this point knew that Colonel was Dutch. No one in this country knew Colonel was Dutch. So that tells you something about the state of the internet at that time, which of course didn't exist. But I mean, the extent of the way in which things could be discreetly set aside, left in one place or another, but didn't. But in any case, so after 61, there was no more talk of a world tour. Although right at that time, he picked up Colonel and set out to book Elvis on something like a 40-date U.S. tour, which would be done in conjunction with RCA. And again, this gives the lie to the idea that he wanted Elvis to make movies, he wanted this or that. That wasn't the case at all. He was inspired by Elvis's performance at Pearl Harbor,
Right.
to raise funds for the USS Arizona Memorial, which again is an amazing story. But the performance was so extraordinary, and Colonel, I think, had the revelation, and this is what makes him happy, and almost immediately started setting up this tour, which would have begun either at the end of 62 or in 63. And it never happened because basically RCA backed out.
Right.
And so then the next thing that happened and that set the stage for a return to live performing was the 68 special, which again, people's understanding of it, I think, is just not right. It's wrong. I mean, in the sense that Colonel was seen as somebody who opposed it, and yet Colonel was the person who, first of all, set it up as a Christmas special. Second of all, long before the show itself was shot, agreed to the suggestion of the singer sewing machine artistic representative who said this should be a tribute to Elvis as a great artist, and Colonel immediately said yes and never interfered again, had nothing to do with the special, never set up any opposition. So you say, how does this happen? Well, people like a villain. That's how it happens.
But then the guy who was, I think, 24, I can't remember his name, but who directed it.
He wasn't 24. He
was quite
minimizing
young.
his. No, he wasn't that young. He was about 35.
Was he?
That's young.
Yes, okay, but
But
he
that
said
isn't the way. I mean,
he said that once he then was setting up things with Elvis, and then the Colonel had prevented him ever seeing Elvis again, and that was the end of that relationship. I mean,
I don't think that's true. I mean, it's just his partner Bones Howe painted a very different picture, and
Right.
he was the musical director of it. And it wasn't that he fully admired Colonel. He said basically Colonel was quite open with them. They would get paid, and they were. The reason I say that wasn't Steve Binder's age is because he had, as many people in Hollywood do, and maybe I should be telling you I'm 24, but he had just lowered his age. And when I first wrote about this, I thought he was, I described him as young, 31, something like that. It wasn't that he was old, but he wasn't that young, and he had a considerable history behind him. But the point is that Bones Howe, wonderful guy, he described their interaction with Colonel, and basically they were looking to get a cut on the album that they were sure was going to come out of it. Colonel kept saying, I don't know about that. That's RCA's business, which Bones, neither was in belief for a minute. And in the end, as Bones described it, Colonel said, look, you're not going to be getting $1 million out of this. You're going to be getting $1 million worth of education. And Bones agreed that was the case, and had never had. But there was no outright. There was no opposition from Colonel. He was best friends with the NBC producer, whose name escapes me right now, and they clowned around the whole time and did nothing but and in the most amicable way, and the only direct opposition that occurred was when everybody was shown an early cut of the special after the filming had been complete. I think it was in August of '68. There was no Christmas song. And the one thing that Colonel had insisted on when he gave up the Christmas show was that there had to be one Christmas song. It was going to be broadcast at Christmas. He believed in the ever-presentness of Christmas and Easter. Not because he was religious. He wasn't religious at all, but you can keep selling the records from that over and over, in that season, the seasonal character of it. And so Colonel wrote a very angry letter to the vice president of NBC, saying that contractually, I was assured again and again, contractually, it's required that there be, if you don't want to do a Christmas song, fine. Let's just, we'll ditch this special, we'll shoot a Christmas special. And then the Christmas song was restored. But that was literally the only point of conflict the entire time. Now, you may not believe me because you've read the opposite, but if you look in the book, if you look in Careless Love, the same case is made, not because I don't have any, I'm not committed to one thing or another. I'm just only committed to, but the correspondence, the internal memos, the company memos are cited, and they're all dated, and they show that was the case. There was never any opposition from Colonel to the show.
Yes, well, that's interesting. But then you said that in '61 they had been planning this world tour, and obviously it never happened. I mean, there was also, how do you feel about that idea that, the Colonel never wanted Elvis to go abroad because, there was some shady part of his past that would mean that he might get in trouble if he was to leave America?
No, the shady part of his past was he was an illegal immigrant. Now, the ultimate mystery, and something that many, many people were at that time, they just, people, famous Dutch artists who came to this country at the same time. I wish I had prepared better for this, but he went to the Venice Biennale again, without any citizenship. He was able to, and eventually he got his citizenship because he became worried about it. The great mystery, the huge mystery, is why wasn't Colonel a citizen? He came to this country. He served in the army. He re-enlisted in the army. That in itself is sufficient for citizenship. There was an amnesty declared. He married an American citizen. That in itself is sufficient. There was an amnesty declared for all people who had entered the country illegally in 1940. Why didn't he simply take advantage of the amnesty? I talked to Luann about this quite a bit. I talked to people who knew Colonel very well. The consensus, and I mean, I don't have anything else to advance against it. Is Colonel also Colonel was very friendly with Lyndon Johnson. He became friendly with him when Johnson was a senator, and remained friendly with him after Johnson was president. So why not, take advantage of that? He knew a lot of powerful people.
Yes.
And the only consensus, and it makes no sense, so that's why I say it's a mystery, is that Colonel never wanted to be in the position of asking anyone for help. And he didn't see it as a disadvantage, that it later became. Mike Romanoff, for instance, the Hollywood restaurateur, was somebody who came to the country long before Colonel, was never a citizen. For years and years was not a citizen, never had a legal problem. And the Dutch, the very famous Dutch artist, again, left the country. But why? As far as Elvis, going abroad, I think that the best case, for why Colonel was against him. What Colonel always said was they can't provide. Elvis didn't go back to live performing until '69.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't an issue up until that point. It had been something that had been in the planning stages in 57, 58, in 60, and seriously in the planning stages. It never happened. What, could it have happened? I think so, but we'll never know. But so basically, we're talking about the 70s, and Colonel's rationale was they didn't have the security to protect Elvis. They didn't have any idea which was a theme that he had used before. He'd expressed it in when the Army wanted to do a charity show with Elvis. And Colonel was against that, against giving away. You don't want to give away what you later want to sell. But,
right.
But the thing is that his argument to the Army was, you don't realize the security it will take to put on a show like that. And eventually he persuaded them they didn't want to take responsibility for that. But so he said security, you can't, in many ways, I think what he was talking about was Elvis's security and the fact that with the number, let's call it prescription medication, that he was taking increasingly, but really from fairly early on. And by the time that foreign travel was contemplated, he couldn't go. He was not willing to go anywhere,
right,
without his medication. And the question that a number of people raised to me, not Colonel directly, but was who was going to carry that medication for him? Which of his, the guys around him was so loyal that he would be willing to go to jail for Elvis by carrying, and what about Elvis's doctors? Would they be, who were omnipresent in that time? But the most direct witness to this, and I'm not trying to make excuses, but was the Tom Hewlett, who was really Colonel's closest associate in the touring, the one person the Colonel trusted absolutely, and who knew the business through and through, who had really pioneered in the rock tour. He had put on everybody, from the late '60s on, Janis Joplin, Creedence Clearwater, Cream, just these national tours.
Yes.
And he had taken, I'm trying to remember who it was, a British group to Japan for maybe you know who it was.
No,
I
don't.
It's in the book, but it's not Vanilla Fudge. That's what always comes to mind. But he had taken this group for a very successful tour of Japan, and brought back a Japanese promoter who was prepared to offer Elvis a great deal of money, and uh, for a tour. And all of this was in conjunction with Colonel. And Tom Hewlett told me about the guys around Elvis were just so excited about going to Japan. This is fantastic. Elvis is going to be renewed. He's going to be, this is going to just completely win him over. The reception that he gets in Japan, and Tom Hewlett, they wanted to know all about the tour that Tom Hewlett had led over there. And then he got a message that Elvis wanted to see him up in his suite at the Hilton in Las Vegas. And he said, Elvis was curious about the tour that he had led, but had expressed zero interest in going there himself.
Right.
And I think people discount how satisfied Elvis was with the life he was leading. He liked being at Graceland. He didn't seem to be able to live without the drugs that were prescribed for him by any number of doctors. He worked hard, in his shows. He enjoyed the reception he got from his fans, but it's like Priscilla said to me when I interviewed her for Careless Love. She said, the guys around Elvis, they all wanted to go to Europe. And again, this may be doing a disservice to the guys because they were all different and they had different, but they all wanted to go to Europe, and they were absolutely convinced that Elvis wanted to go to Europe. This is years before. This is maybe, say 64, 65. And she said, but when we got behind closed doors, Elvis had no interest in going to Europe. He wanted to go home to Memphis. Now, she says, to be honest, she said at the time, and I thought this was very fair of her. She said, I don't know what he said to them behind closed doors. I went behind those other closed doors. So you can't be absolutely certain that what somebody says to you is the absolute truth.
No.
But she said he never gave any indication, that he wanted to go to Europe, that he had any interest in. He said, his time in Germany was enough for him, she said. And I'm not sure that she wouldn't have enjoyed going to Europe, but she said he had no interest.
Right. God, that's interesting, isn't it? How did the Colonel, how did he sort of navigate his kind of the change in kind of business and entertainment world of the late 60s into the 70s, and sort of the rise of, suddenly the Beatles came along, and then psychedelic rock, and then you had Woodstock. I mean,
it had no effect on Elvis's business.
No, but I just wondered what, Tom Parker was thinking at this stage. Did he feel threatened or worried? Did he feel that, his kind of the person that he attached himself to so closely, was he ever sort of a little bit concerned that he was potentially going to sort of struggle?
No, I don't think so. I mean, Colonel, again, was an extraordinarily bright and elastic person. Colonel could adapt himself to any circumstances, as he had when he hoboed around this country as a young man, and as he continued to in the, in navigating. And for instance, one of the things about, the Elvis touring, and I put in some of the excerpt from his book about rules for touring, that he had for the people who worked on the tour. But it became more and more complicated. The travel became more complicated, everything. And he adapted to all that. But the thing I think that has to be understood, and that just generally is not at all understood, is that Colonel fell in love with Elvis from the moment he first met him. I don't think the opposite was true. I think that Elvis placed his faith in Colonel from the moment that Colonel sold his Sun contract to RCA, which was about 10 months later. But Colonel was at the top of, let's call it the country music game.
Yeah.
He had managed Eddie Arnold for 10 years. Eddie Arnold had achieved greater success in country music than anybody almost before or since. I mean, unless you consider Taylor Swift a country singer, in which case she far surpassed Eddie Arnold. But I'd say she went pretty pop. But he was managing Hank Snow when he first saw Elvis in January '55. Hank Snow was at the top of country music at that time, and that could have and should have been Colonel's focus. He formed a partnership with Hank Snow, in addition to managing him, where they would be not a promotional team, a booking agency as well as, and I think they may have formed a publishing company.
Right.
But from the moment he first met Elvis, who was just 20 years old at the time, and whom nobody else was prepared to take a chance on. When Colonel went out to other promoters, in other cities, people who were successful, they all said, well, this kid seems interesting, but no, we're not prepared to take a flyer on this, come back in a couple of years when he's proved himself. Colonel essentially gave up everything he had achieved, which was everything. That's why
I thought Eddie Arnold had fired the Colonel.
He did. He fired after 10 years.
Right.
And that's an interesting and complicated story, and it has. But I don't think. But again, the career he built for Eddie Arnold with Eddie Arnold, who was also in his own way an extraordinary person, was unparalleled, and that was not the reason for for Eddie Arnold firing him. There were two reasons. One was that Colonel had formed an other company with his associate, Tom Diskin, and Jamboree Attractions, I believe. Right. And he had been involved with Tommy Sands. Colonel was a great promoter of Tommy Sands, another talent, but since Tommy was like 12 or 13 years old. And so Jamboree started working for Tommy Sands and a number of other people under the aegis of Tom Diskin. And Eddie Arnold said, wait a minute. Eddie Arnold was correct in his perception that Colonel was involved in Jamboree, that he was, let's say, he was a partner in Jamboree, but maybe a senior partner. And so, but the other thing was that Colonel and Eddie Arnold were the opposite in terms of temperament. And Colonel was brusque and brash, and Eddie Arnold was smooth and wanted to move up to sort of uptown country, which he did very successfully. And Colonel was prepared to support that and had supported other changes in Eddie Arnold's career. But he wasn't the person you would want to take along to your, tuxedo-clad cocktail party. and that was... there was a real class, and his really eloquent letters from Eddie Arnold to Colonel explaining that, and fascinating letters from Colonel responding to it. And Colonel continued to book Eddie Arnold until Elvis's death, and book him they worked out a contractual thing where he booked him for 10. Eddie Arnold made very few personal appearances, and Colonel booked a substantial portion of them and brought Eddie Arnold to Las Vegas after Elvis had opened in Las Vegas. And at Colonel's memorial service, Eddie Arnold gave the most eloquent, no frills, no falderall, tribute to the Colonel's talent and honesty. That's way more than he wanted.
Yes, well, no, it's fascinating.
But my simple point was simply that Colonel's at the top of the country music game. He's operating in a world that Elvis wants to rise up in. Even Sam Phillips recognized it at the time. Colonel essentially was willing to gamble everything on this untried, unproven, untested 20-year-old.
Yes.
And that's what he did. And within 10 months, he had him signed to RCA. But had that not worked out, Colonel would have really basically been stranded, because he hadn't cut off all ties, but he had, in essence, cut off all commitments other than to Elvis, and the drama of that signing. And so really from that point on, from the end of '55 on, maybe for, I'd say, 10 years, 8 or 9, maybe 10 years, the relationship between them was one of total trust and mutual belief. Each of them had his job to do. Colonel had nothing to do with the creative side, nothing to do with music explicitly. And Elvis had nothing to do with business, which was extraordinarily successful. Now, you brought up Eddie Arnold, perhaps to your eternal rue, but but should Elvis in 1965 have said, "Look, we've had this wonderful relationship. You've made it possible for me to do all these things that I've wanted to do, reach out in all these directions, but I think now I want to go in my direction. You go yours." And had Elvis been Eddie Arnold, that's what he would have done. Had Elvis been Sam Cooke did that again and again. He got everything he could in a sincere way from each person that he met along the line, and then he moved on, having absorbed everything they had to offer.
Mm-hmm.
So should Elvis have done that? Maybe, because really the reason why that the book, Colonel and the King, ends up being a tragedy is because basically they move away from each other. Each of them has his own addiction. Neither of them can bring up the other's addiction to the other, because then that would bring back their criticism upon themselves. And they end up with Colonel saying to Luann, but talking about, I think it was in Connecticut. It was maybe not New Haven, but in Connecticut, a show in maybe 76 or so, saying I went to see him, and I don't think he just didn't recognize me. I don't know if he meant that literally. And he said, "Where is the Elvis that, I knew? Where's the Elvis that I love?" And Elvis might have said the same thing. So
Right.
it really, that was what surprised me in writing the book, was it became, I thought it would be this rollicking adventure, but there's lots of rollicking adventures in it. And I think, but it ends up being a linked tragedy.
A very big tragedy, because there was a line at the beginning which I thought was kind of amazing. It's, I think, quoting the Colonel, was, "Only those that you love can hurt you," which I thought, is that,
Yeah.
I thought it was kind of really powerful.
That was in a letter to Elvis saying, "You and I are much alike."
And that was like, God, because I went, wow. And I had to think that, I thought, yes, this is true. This is,
But this was early on, and it's again an extraordinary expression of emotion, and an extraordinarily honest expression of emotion on Colonel's part, and expressing their solidarity of feeling and of purpose. And but it's an amazing letter, I think.
well, yes, I was, I thought, God, it's quite, it just hit you. But then, I mean, did the Colonel end up with no money? Did he gamble it all away at the end, or does he? Because what happens to Luann at this point?
Colonel from early on in Elvis's career, he set aside. He didn't mind losing all of his money. I mean, he didn't mind gambling it away from quite early on.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't see that as losses. It was, maybe I'm exaggerating. I mean, it became so much more pronounced after Elvis opened in Vegas. It became, and there's a lot in the book about, for instance, Tom Diskin, his closest associate from the beginning, trying to tell him, "You've got to stop this," and Colonel just turning away from him just in fury, and wouldn't speak to him for a great deal of time. Also, Freddie Beanstalk, who represented the publisher, Hill and Range. But tell me your question again.
Oh, yeah. So
I was on my way to it.
Did he end with no money, or and what happened to his wife? Did she kind of have something?
Well, what happened was that at the point where Elvis became so reckless with his money, which was the mid-'60s, I mean, and there are letters here where Colonel writes to Elvis early on, opens a savings account for him, tells him how he has to save his money. It corresponds with Vernon about trying to control Elvis's spending, which both of them recognize nobody can do. But at some point in the mid-'60s, when his first wife, Marie, started to become sick, and Elvis's spending was just vastly out of control. I mean, that's the reason why Elvis went to Washington, D.C. When he met Nixon, it was after an argument with Priscilla and Vernon, who tried to address this issue, and he just stormed out of the house and ended up in L.A. But I'd say in the mid '60s, Colonel, maybe before, but that's all. This is where I know it from. Colonel basically always kept $1 million in the bank against that rainy day, which he foresaw might happen, which was really a rainy day, which might come from two directions. One would be because Elvis was on the verge of losing Graceland at one point. I mean, so Elvis was always on the verge of overextending himself to the extent that who knew what would happen. And Colonel's wife, Marie, was increasingly ill, required more and more care. And so he had $1 million in the bank. He had $1 million in the bank when he died. And that basically was his life. He didn't have anything else. He owned the house, I don't think it was a condominium. It was in a community, and he owned that. Whatever the property was, whether it was a condominium, he owned that. And so, so Colonel's widow, Loanne, lived in that afterwards and had money, and he continued to have some income flow from the Elvis estate, the Elvis business, but he was not a wealthy man when he died, and he was not concerned about it, but he didn't leave Loanne adrift.
Right. There was a slightly well, that I just was always curious how much he managed to gamble, and whether he still gets any. I mean, there aren't such things as royalty checks. It still appears in the Colonel's
some, but not much. I mean, at one point I could have cited chapter and verse what was left to come, but there was some income stream, but not much.
Right.
From Elvis.
Is that the same with Elvis then? Does he still have a big income stream each year from the record?
Oh yeah, no, he has because among other things, Colonel set it up for him to own things like the '68 special, the '72 special. I mean, I've heard that they're now preparing to market the the '77 special, the CBS special. This was all through Colonel's doing that. He also had profit participation in most of the movies from the '60s. So they continued to generate income for a time, and there were also deals made that although he sold his masters in '73, there was a continuation of a certain amount of income stream. I mean, he had you look in Elvis day by day and you can see what his income was, and it was absolutely extraordinary in the last few years, and the estate was brought back to life by Jack Soden. The Colonel volunteered to help in every way he could, and he became friendly with Jack Soden, but I think Jack Soden wisely chose to pursue it on his own. He opened up Graceland. It was a huge success. It was a gamble, but a huge success, and Jack Soden deserves enormous credit for everything he did to restore Elvis's estate. Once they cleared the legal there were a bunch of legal hurdles, but once they cleared that, what he achieved was extraordinary.
And how did you gain, or what did you sort of tell of what happened to the Colonel when Elvis passed away? How did he sort of end the late '70s and then the '80s and into the following?
Well, I think he, as Loanne said, he was never the same as anybody who knew him. He was still brilliant. He still continued to operate in his own way. He was very much involved. He was running the estate for, I think, Vernon died in '80, and maybe he was running the estate until roughly '82. and there were lawsuits in 82 and 83, which which separated him from the estate, but actually acknowledged that he had not taken everything that had come to him through the willing contractual agreements of first Vernon following Elvis's death, and then the trustees of the estate. And in the end, the lawsuits against the colonel ended up with his being paid, I think, $2.1 million.
Right.
So I'm not trying to justify, I mean, I believe that capitalism is capitalism, and many of the people who throw bric-a-brats themselves perhaps might be subject to the same criticisms, but I'm not.
Yes. Well, I just wondered if the colonel just had a feeling of, I don't know, a sort of a worthlessness in his life after that, and just an emptiness which was only filled through sort of gambling and sort of.
No, because the gambling really started, uh, just full time, probably reached its pinnacle when he started taking Elvis out on tour in the early 70s.
What was his main gambling thing? What was his choice?
Any game you couldn't win.
Right, he was consistent.
Had he gambled on the basis of, I mean, he played poker, he gambled on the basis of his intellect, he would have come out a great winner. But I think roulette was one of the things. But he never gambled on anything he could win. I mean, George Hamilton, who was very close to Colonel, the actor, said he never could understand it. And Colonel had a very sophisticated grasp of games, but what led him to be drawn to games that he could never win was baffling to George Hamilton, and it's baffling to me.
Yes, it's very. Did he feel like he needed somehow to punish himself? There was some sort of form?
I don't think so. No. But again, you're talking about gambling addiction, and I'm not prepared to offer my analysis.
No.
I don't really have a great insight into it. It's just, people are addicted to all kinds of things, and it's hard to understand how the addiction can overcome their
Yes.
intellectual, so I'm not the person to prescribe or proscribe anybody's behavior.
Absolutely, it's best not to. And with the book coming out, is Loanne still alive? By the way, I didn't.
No, she died. In fact, she died just as I was setting. I kept writing her these letters because I was talking to ABG, who represent the estate now, Authentic Brands Group, and I felt like we were making real progress and the book was going to happen. And I kept writing to her. I think we're making progress. We're gaining. And then I just I didn't want to raise false hopes. And I just stopped. I didn't want to tell her until the deal was done. And she died just before it was, I think sometime around 2020.
Right, God, that's yes.
I may have that slightly wrong, but it was around that time.
Yes, God. Well, that's such a shame, actually. Yeah, and did
No, it
anybody?
was devastating.
It would have been, yeah. My God. And anybody else from the estate, have they commented about it or come back to you from the Elvis kind of world?
Well, sure. I mean, I've heard from lots of people, but Angie Marchese, who runs the archives at Graceland, put together a phenomenal Colonel exhibit at Graceland. I mean, across the street from Graceland, in their sort of museum space, and just a great exhibit. So it was wonderful to see. I mean, it was very comprehensive and very insightful.
And do you feel, just lastly, that now that you've had the book and you've had the research and the letters, do you feel like people's opinion of the Colonel and that narrative will hopefully shift quite a bit? Did you feel like that was one of the reasons for putting this publication together?
I wouldn't say it as a publication. I'd call it a book. It's just, but
Yes.
no, I told you. I mean, I saw it as an obligation to history to do my best to set the story straight. I don't think you can ever judge success or failure on the basis of how many people embrace the story you've told. It's gratifying when they do. You can't take it as a judgment against yourself or your subject when they don't. So, no, I don't have any absolute sense of. I think that when I spoke at Graceland last summer, the interviewer, Tom Brown, who's a great guy and had run, I think, Turner Movie Classics, and is an extremely good interviewer. And when he introduced me, I came out to, I think, a good deal of silence. I mean, I think because people felt perhaps that a book about Colonel Parker that viewed him sympathetically, honestly, was a betrayal. And Tom Brown gave a very brief talk, but said, you're here because you love Elvis and you've read Peter's other books and he loves Elvis. But one thing about loving a subject like this is you want to know everything about the subject, not just the good things. You want to know the truth.
Yes.
And from Peter's work, this is a very rough thing, and I'm not saying it to, pat myself on the shoulder, but he says one thing about Peter's work, is that he's always tried to tell the truth. And I've read this book carefully, and he had. And I think if you read it carefully, it may not change your mind, but I think it'll open up your mind some if you read it with an open mind. And he then interviewed me. I mean, I thought it was an extraordinary statement to be made in Trump's America, since it was almost the opposite of what is in the what is offered in the public political arena.
Mm.
And at the and I think people listened, and then afterwards I signed almost 300 books, I think, the next day, and a great many of the people said, I really was not prepared. I didn't want to read this book. But when I listened to what Tom Brown said and what you said, it opened me up. I can't guarantee you that I'm going to, that I'll agree with what you say, but it opened me up to the possibility that maybe there was more to the story than I thought. So, I mean, that to me was a very gratifying thing. But I don't think you write a book and you can't, like I say, you can't measure its success or failure by I don't have an argument to advance. I'm gratified, for example, that Last Train to Memphis helped reestablish Elvis as reestablish people considering Elvis as a creative artist, a great creative artist. And, you just hope if a book sticks around long enough, you hope that it will continue to influence people, and it may lead people to do their own work, and that may argue with your work, which is just the nature of history.
Yes.
But at least it rather than turning history into a cartoon and turning someone like Colonel Parker, a person of such brilliant achievement and extraordinary intellect and complicated personality, turning him into a caricature or a cartoon figure. And so, you hope that I hope that my book will help people come to a more full dimensional view.
Yes. Well, I'm always fascinated and curious. I mean, yeah, it was kind of interesting because just on that point that I made at the beginning with my love of David Bowie, but kind of recently his daughter sort of had this piece that she'd sort of put up on the internet about what her life was like and what her relationship was like with her parents. And it's like, God, we all thought it was this. And then she's explained,
Yeah.
actually, she's had the most horrendous, she was very troubled, difficult, teenager. It was a terrible time. And it was like, God, it's just, the truth, unless she's completely made all that up, completely, sort of makes you think differently about what that that narrative one had has now completely changed. We said, oh my God, I didn't know, I had no idea that that was the case. So now I have to sort of rethink it and sort of reprocess. And I guess it's the same with your book. It's that, because it's the letters, it's like, well, they're fact, and whether you want
Yeah,
to.
no, I wanted Colonel to speak for himself, and as much as I could, I did that. And I have no, whatever you call it,
Agenda.
no agenda. Exactly. I'm going to claim that word for myself. I have no personal agenda. I mean, everybody I've written about are people. I mean, I care about them. I'm never interested in trying to show off at their expense. I mean, it's easy to do that as you write. You can make yourself look like some kind of a, philosopher king and make your subject look like a fool. If it's easy to do because you're in control of the narrative, and I've tried to do everything I can to avoid that. Whoever I'm writing about, and there are a lot of very different kinds of people, and that's been in my mind from the beginning. Whether I was writing about Muddy Waters, or Skip James, or Sam Phillips or Colonel Parker or Sam Cooke. I mean, it's an attempt to give the full range of their lives and of their personalities. And so, it's not for me to claim anything, but that's my aspiration.
Yes, that's amazing. Well, look, thank you ever so much, Peter. This has been amazing. Do you have a project that you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, I'm working. Well, I've got a collection of short stories coming out in October. I've been working on those for the last 10 or 15 years. That takes me back to the listener saying, don't ever give up on a project. It can last forever.
Yes.
But, and this is going back, the first two books I wrote, which looked more like pamphlets, were short story collections, which came out when I was 20 and 23. So this is a long time ago, but a long time to come around to it. And so I'm doing that. Now I'm working on a book. This is a recent book. I mean, a recent project, not 10 or 15 years. I've just started on it, about the evolution of Little Richard's artistry, not his public personality, which I'm really not interested in particularly, but of the brilliance and revolutionary nature of his art and the way in which it evolved and the extent to which he was driven, much like Elvis, consciously driven from the time he was quite young, and to both to express himself and to create a new form for self-expression. So that's it. This is intended to be sort of, I mean, as ironic as it may sound, sort of like my book "Searching for Robert Johnson," in the sense that it's not intended to be a long book, and it's intended to focus on the artistry,
Yes.
not the personality.
Amazing. Well, that's fantastic. Well, look forward to that. But look,
I wish
thank you.
now I wish David Bowie could read that, because he was a huge Little Richard fan, wasn't he?
He was a huge Little Richard. Yes, he sent off when he was very young a picture of Little Richard, I think, and yes, he still has it, and it's kind of been sellotaped because I think the corner got ripped off.
You mean it's signed by Little Richard?
Oh, I can't remember. He's doing the Michael Parkinson show, and he mentions it, and he's mentioned it elsewhere, but perhaps it is signed. And this signed picture of the. I'll have to find it and send you a link to that interview where he's.
Yeah, that'd be interesting because you remember remember Little Richard came over with Sam Cooke in '62, and then kept coming back for the next few years. So
yes, and like I said, Lemmy from Motorhead was always Little Richard, and then
Bob Dylan too.
And then obviously Elvis was the other person. So it's that generation. But look, thank you ever so much. This has been amazing. And yes, I'll keep in touch with your publicist. And yes,
well, I'm hoping you will compress this to just a nucleus and a nugget of sheer unalloyed brilliance with none of the foolishness that I've introduced into the conversation.
Absolutely. I will be doing that. I will do that.
Just make me look good, okay?
I'll make you look very good. But look, thank you, Peter. This has been amazing. Thanks. And have a lovely evening. All the best for the summer. Take care.
Yeah, you too.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
And that was me in conversation with Peter Guralnick, talking about his life in music, really, and writing, and his new book, The Colonel and the King, available from all good bookshops and also online. This has been the C86 Show. David Eastaugh. Have a great week. Stay safe.